On a frigid winter evening, the ocean possessed an uncanny ability to hush the entire surroundings. High overhead, a waning moon glowed faintly against the heavens, casting a slender ribbon of silvery light over the undulating waves of the Pacific. Wave after wave surged and subsided in an age-old cadence, oblivious to the colossal conflict tearing through distant lands. Only the breeze skimming the waves broke the silence, and even that arrived as a murmur. To any lookout aboard a Japanese destroyer that evening, the scene could have appeared serene, misleadingly tranquil. Yet below the ocean's glistening facade, a hunter lurked in ambush. The vessel was the USS Archerfish, a Balao-class submarine belonging to the U.S. Navy. Measuring 301 feet in length, she consisted of riveted steel coated in muted gray. Her conning tower merged into obscurity against the moon-kissed waters upon surfacing. When diving, her periscope and radar mast scarcely pierced the skyline. Within her pressurized hull, the atmosphere felt stifling and dense, laced with scents of lubricant, perspiration, and mechanical parts. Crew members navigated silently amid levers, instruments, and navigation charts, speaking in subdued tones with unwavering focus. They had endured the war for several years by then, but this instant carried a distinct undercurrent. An event of immense significance was taking shape. At its heart was Commander Joseph F. Enright, a 33-year-old leader with piercing dark eyes and a track record that had lately been in doubt. He had encountered defeat in the past. During a prior assignment, he had faltered at key junctures and come back from his mission without launching even one torpedo. For a submariner amid hostilities, that kind of outing transcended mere letdown. It was humiliating. Enright positioned himself at the periscope, one hand casually on the handle, the other absently touching a rosary tucked in his pocket. As a Catholic, he wasn't overtly devout, but those beads offered solace whenever the burden of command grew overwhelming, and the load was substantial. That evening to the north, past the shores of Tokyo Bay, a massive Japanese ship was underway. The radar technician had spotted it initially, merely a dot on the screen, 12 miles distant, holding a steady southwest heading. The echo was enormous, beyond question, and Enright sensed deep down this wasn't some routine cargo hauler. The puzzle remained. What exactly was it? Earlier that night, the Archerfish had been tasked with lifeguard operations, poised to retrieve American pilots shot down from attacks that ultimately didn't occur. Released from that role, she had chanced upon a valuable target, its full importance still unrecognized by those on board. Enright's mind drifted to Japan's mighty battleships, Yamato and Musashi, titans that had dominated the oceans. Musashi had gone down in Leyte Gulf only weeks before, pummeled by swarms of U.S. aircraft. Might Yamato be venturing forth, or could this be an even odder discovery, perhaps unprecedented? The sub quivered faintly as she altered her path. In the control center, sailors hunched over the chart table, sketching trajectories of approach, refining angles with waxed crayons. They operated with restrained haste, aware that precision in speed and positioning spelled survival or doom. An error at this stage wouldn't just forfeit the quarry. It could summon annihilation from the escorting destroyers surely guarding it. For the time being, however, the Archerfish maintained a cautious separation, trailing on the surface, blending her outline into the gloom and wispy cloud cover. Aboard the sub, existence was fraught yet orderly. The team had adapted to the cramped confines long ago. Torpedo handlers dozed next to their ordnance in the forward compartment, officers rotated through shared berths, and each sailor responded to his post on reflex. A perpetual drone filled the air, ventilators whirring, pumps throbbing, the subdued throb of the diesel engines while afloat. Sailors donned damp uniforms, some down to tank tops in the humid spaces. During such evenings, anticipation amplified every noise. The groan of the casing under oceanic pressure, the splash of surf on the prow, the soft hum from the radar display. Every auditory cue swelled with promise, and Enright refused to allow promise to slide into doubt once more. He had vowed that months prior during a poker game at Midway Naval Base. A higher-ranking officer had eyed his bold feint and queried, "Joe, do you lead a sub like you handle your cards?" His reply was straightforward, "Yes." That response had earned him a fresh opportunity. Now, peering through the periscope, that opportunity faced its trial. What Enright couldn't foresee was the sheer enormity awaiting him. The craft he pursued was Shinano, the crowning achievement of Japan's naval builders, displacing 71,190 tons when fully laden. She stood as the biggest aircraft carrier ever constructed. Finished in utmost secrecy, she had entered service just days before, dispatched into the darkness with a bare-bones crew, incomplete equipment, and minimal preparation. Intended as an emblem of resilience and resistance, she was. Unbeknownst to her, the massive vessel was gliding steadily into the crosshairs of a lone submarine, led by a commander desperate for atonement, much like the Japanese fleet yearned for an impossible turnaround. The moon ducked momentarily behind a shroud of clouds, casting the horizon into deeper shadow. At that instant, the crew of the Archerfish sensed the sea falling into an eerie hush, as if the entire ocean were pausing in anticipation. Enright pressed his eye to the periscope again. The outline was hazy, yet unmistakable as it hovered there. He spotted the accompanying ships, shadowy blotches slicing through the waves beside the primary target. A destroyer veered abruptly, charging in their direction, and briefly it appeared the pursuers had turned into prey. Then, without reason, the destroyer veered away, circled back, and took up its protective position once more. The opportunity lingered. Enright murmured to his officers, "Steady and resolute. Keep on her trail. Allow her to weave. We'll spot where she levels out." His instructions weren't mere commands. They embodied a vow to his own resolve, his team, and his professional path. He refused to waver. On this occasion, he would rely on his gut feelings. He would launch the attack. The hands of the clock edged closer to midnight. Often, the contest of endurance, navigation, and destiny was underway. It was 1944, and the momentum of World War II had shifted with an irreversible momentum. For Japan, the realm that had expanded from icy fantasies to the humid forests of Burma, the conflict was no longer one of conquest. It centered on mere endurance. The domain was now purely reactive, pummeled from above, choked on the seas, and hemorrhaging across its remote island strongholds. The Pacific Ocean had ceased to serve as an expansive barrier shielding the Japanese mainland. Instead, it had transformed into a contracting arena of combat with every month that passed. U.S. troops had bounded from atoll to atoll in an unyielding push, the Solomons, the Gilberts, the Marshalls, and then the Marianas. Come summer 1944, operations in the Philippines were in full swing. General Douglas MacArthur, honoring his renowned pledge, had come back. His soldiers were pressing forward through Leyte and further as Admiral Chester Nimitz orchestrated the mighty armadas of the U.S. Pacific Fleet in a methodical progression toward Okinawa. The waters had grown outright adversarial to Japanese vessels. The Imperial Navy had once commanded those expanses, but submarines from America now held sway under the surface. These stealthy underwater warriors were delivering crushing blows. Subs such as the Archerfish had shredded Japan's commercial armada. Oil tankers ferrying fuel from the East Indies were sinking quicker than new ones could be constructed. Freighters hauling provisions, armaments, and essentials fell victim readily to subs equipped with Perseverance and guided missiles. By 1944, Japan had forfeited over 50% of its merchant marine, and the deficits were turning paralyzing. Production lines idled, petroleum supplies dwindled, and everyday necessities became rare. The equations of warfare had swung harshly against Japan. Previously, the empire could replenish its naval and aerial losses, but now every lost craft stood beyond recovery. The vast dockyards that had forged the armada responsible for the Pearl Harbor raid were barely managing repairs on injured ships, far less constructing fresh ones. Metal was in short supply. Expert laborers had been conscripted, and U.S. aerial assaults were starting to hammer manufacturing hubs. Over the surface, conditions fared no better. The U.S. Navy had gathered the mightiest carrier task forces in existence. The swift carriers of the 3rd and 5th Fleets patrolled the Pacific at will, their planes hammering Japanese outposts and even hitting the mainland directly. The airspace had lost its security. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress, boasting extraordinary reach, had initiated daytime raids on Japan's urban areas. Tokyo and Nagoya smoldered amid the infernos, with additional strikes on the horizon. The Imperial Navy, formerly the pinnacle of modernity and dread in the Pacific, had faded to a mere echo of its past prowess. Its aviation component had been shattered at Midway back in 1942. Its capital ships had suffered grievous wounds in the Solomons and Marianas, and during the colossal clash of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the grandest sea battle ever fought, Japan had staked its remaining assets on a final desperate throw. The outcome was catastrophe. Carriers including Zuikaku, a survivor of Pearl Harbor, went to the bottom. The colossal battleship Musashi met its end amid unending barrages of U.S. explosives and torpedoes. And although Yamato, the biggest battleship still sailing, had endured the fray, she limped away scarred and withdrawing. The toll on personnel was just as ruinous. Japan's veteran aviators, those who had carried out the Pearl Harbor strike with flawless accuracy, were almost entirely gone. Their replacements received rushed preparation, typically accumulating fewer than 50 hours in the air prior to deployment in battle. In comparison, U.S. aviators reached the battlefield equipped with hundreds of flight hours under their belts. The consequence was devastation overhead. Enemy Japanese planes fell from the sky at rates of 10 to 1 and occasionally even higher. The island nation was depleting its reserves of time, vessels, and strategies. Still, amid this dire predicament, the country held on to a final glimmer of optimism, believing that a formidable innovative arm could alter the tide, at least temporarily. This arm wasn't a fresh dreadnought or an upgraded fighter model. Rather, it was a vessel without precedent in global naval history, a leviathan of an aircraft carrier fortified beyond measure and shrouded in such secrecy that the opposing forces lacked any verified intelligence of its reality. Dubbed Shinano, honoring an ancient Japanese region, she emerged from the framework of a Yamato-class super dreadnought. Intended as an impregnable bastion on the waves, Japanese strategists were convinced that if this carrier could be finished and deployed, it would fortify their perimeter defenses encircling the core territories. She might transport sufficient planes and specialized assault craft to repel the U.S. push, potentially even endangering the approaching assault armadas that loomed on the horizon. The rationale shaping Shinano embodied Japan's shifting military philosophy. The days of envisioning conclusive engagements where skilled crews and superior gear would triumph had passed. Now, they required a platform resilient enough to endure U.S. aerial barrages, functioning as a mobile hub for plane maintenance, and launching the emerging kamikaze ordnance integral to their tactics. The rust-hued, rocket-propelled suicide aircraft and Shio explosive speedboats embodied a bleak assessment that trading Japanese personnel for enemy hulls could yield advantageous exchanges. Yet, while constructing her, the harsh truths of conflict bore down relentlessly. Dockworkers labored through rotations exceeding 16 hours, resources dwindled, standards eroded, and timelines tightened. Shinano's finalization was accelerated to the point where essential security evaluations were overlooked. The realm demanded the vessel, and it demanded her immediately. In the capital, officials nurtured fantasies. Should Shinano cruise with a complete squadron aloft, she could fell flocks of B-29 bombers. If she navigated toward the Philippines, she might sabotage MacArthur's amphibious operations. Merely, the homeland had already turned to tactics revealing the severity of their plight. The kamikaze units signaled frailty, not fortitude, an acknowledgement that traditional combat was untenable. Adolescent flyers, many still in their late teens, were instructed that their ultimate devotion to the sovereign lay in crashing their machines into U.S. vessels. This approach stemmed from hopelessness, cloaked in rhetoric of valor. The surrounding waters off Japan had turned hostile. U.S. submersibles prowled the shorelines without mercy. Squadrons of 3 or 4 subs would synchronize strikes on supply lines, dooming both Guardians and cargo carriers. During late November, while Shinano geared up to depart the yard, scores of subs lay in wait at the entrances to Tokyo Bay. They had segmented the area into surveillance districts, each vessel accountable for its domain, relaying sightings to orchestrate blockades. The majority would remain ignorant of her presence, but one wouldn't, and that solitary clash would seal her doom. To any impartial onlooker, the overarching military landscape was evident. Japan had forfeited the struggle. The lingering uncertainties involved merely the duration of hostilities and the toll in lives before capitulation. Yet, for individuals ensnared in the war's apparatus, the mariners, the constructors, the airmen, such insight eluded them. They pressed on with combat, construction, and aspiration as surrender was inconceivable. Come November 1944, Japan stood as a realm encircled by peril. Its oceans stalked by invisible hunters, its heavens scorched by incendiaries, its urban centers quaking from the inevitability of assault. Amid that tempest ventured Shinano, an immense craft unprepared, untrialed, and laden with the weight of a country's final aspirations. And lurking in the darkness for her was a submersible led by an officer in pursuit of atonement. Every legendary naval behemoth originates as sketches on drafting boards, contours on schematics evoking iron, might, and glory. Shinano's narrative commenced precisely thus, but her purpose would shift repeatedly before she ever met the brine. She originated in 1940, at the zenith of Japan's maritime aspirations, as the third in the Yamato-class behemoths. These were slated to become the biggest, weightiest, most potently gunned capital ships ever forged. Engineered to eclipse any vessel in the U.S. or Royal fleets. Their plating was denser, their ordnance bigger, their tonnage vaster. They embodied the emblem of a dominion pursuing supremacy. The Yamato-class vessels embodied a long-standing doctrine in naval combat that traced its roots to earlier eras. Japanese military strategists, recognizing their country's inability to rival America's manufacturing might, emphasized excellence over quantity. Lacking the means to produce greater numbers of vessels than the United States, Japan aimed to craft superior ones. Every battleship in the Yamato class was intended to equal 2 or 3 American equivalents in effectiveness. Their 18.1-inch cannons could engage foes at distances beyond the reach of retaliatory fire. Their plating was engineered to deflect projectiles that would cripple inferior designs. 2 sister ships were finished according to the initial blueprint, Yamato and Musashi, both armed with 9 colossal barrels able to propel projectiles of almost 3,000 pounds over greater distances, and with superior devastation compared to prior naval ordnance. These rounds were capable of breaching 16 inches of plating from beyond 25 miles away. Shinano's foundation was set at the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, a premier facility of the empire, with full anticipation that she would join her siblings as a mighty bastion on the Pacific waves. Work commenced amid rituals and national esteem. Shinto rituals sanctified the site of her assembly. The emperor received updates on the endeavor. Premium alloy was reserved for her frame, and top-tier craftsmen were detailed to the task. Per the preliminary designs, she was slated to reach 72,000 tons when fully laden, carry the identical formidable artillery as her counterparts, and achieve 27 knots even with her immense girth. She stood as more than mere armament, a testament to Japan's engineering mastery. Yet, conflicts often alter grand visions. In June 1942, Japan endured a crushing defeat during the Battle of Midway. 4 key carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, fell in one catastrophic day. With them perished countless seasoned aviators and the core of Japan's carrier-based air force. That clash irreversibly altered Pacific dominance. Japan could no longer depend on its carriers for the aggressive reach it had demonstrated in the initial victories of 1941 and 1942. Midway's fallout prompted a profound overhaul of maritime tactics. Naval architects examined Shinano's substantial frame, still under development in her berth, and confronted a dilemma. Completing her as a battleship would yield yet another artillery outpost in a time when carriers dictated victories. Abandoning her midway was inconceivable. Far too many resources had been committed. The solution crystallized. Shinano would transform into an aircraft carrier, not an ordinary one, but the grandest ever conceived. The refit proved extensive and intricate. Her submerged sections, molded for battleship requirements, needed reconfiguration for novel roles. The fortified core, built to endure heavy barrages, was repurposed to bear a vast internal hangar. In place of turret mounts, plane hoists were fitted. The bridge structure was overhauled and relocated to the right side, following carrier conventions. An airstrip stretching 840 feet in length and 130 feet across topped the entire build. Unlike typical carriers focused on launching large-scale assaults, she was conceived as an auxiliary vessel. An armored stronghold to safeguard task forces, mend planes amid combat, and transport kamikaze aircraft along with explosive motor launches for targeted strikes. By 1944, the nation could no longer muster legions of skilled pilots for standard engagements. The veterans behind the Pearl Harbor raid were largely gone. Substitutes received minimal preparation, frequently under 50 hours in the cockpit. Turning away from traditional aerial might, Japan pursued tools of surprise and last resort. Shinano would embody that arsenal. The veil of secrecy over her build was unparalleled, alarmed by the threat of U.S. air raids that might obliterate her prior to launch. The Navy implemented extreme precautions. The basin housing her construction was capped with a colossal concrete canopy, concealing her from aerial surveillance. Bolstered by massive metal beams, this enclosure converted the yard into an expansive sheltered facility. Laborers laboring on her skeleton were restricted to the premises. They resided in on-site quarters, barred from exiting or contacting outsiders. Harsh penalties, including incarceration or execution, awaited any leaks about the project. Sentries from the military enforced the boundaries. No images of Shinano's progress escaped the confines. Even among the Imperial Navy's ranks, awareness of Shin, her existence remained under strict secrecy. Just a handful of high-ranking officers were allowed access to her details. References to her in paperwork employed pseudonyms. Upon her eventual unveiling, she promised to astonish not only the enemy forces, but also certain members of her own nation. Such intense confidentiality bred its share of complications. Vendors supplying components frequently lacked awareness of the project's true purpose. Collaboration among various divisions faltered. Errors that routine checks might have detected slipped by undetected. Her blueprint challenged the boundaries of maritime architecture. Displacing 71,990 tons when fully laden, Shinano overshadowed all other aircraft carriers in service. Her protected flight deck, unusual for such vessels, endured strikes from 1,000 lb bombs. The armored plating along her sides, reaching up to 8 inches in thickness at the water level, offered unprecedented safeguarding in carrier construction. Watertight bulkheads of robust armor segmented her hangar, designed to confine damage from any one bomb or torpedo to isolated sections rather than the whole vessel. 4 steam turbine engines, generating 150,000 shaft horsepower, propelled her to velocities of 27 knots in spite of her enormous size. The array of defensive weapons proved imposing. 16 5-inch dual-roll cannons, mounted in 8 twin turrets, handled threats from ships or planes alike. More than 125 anti-aircraft guns of 25mm caliber dotted her structure, ensuring interlocking coverage. 12 28-barrel rocket launchers unleashed barrages of detonating projectiles into the air, forming a barrier of shrapnel to repel incoming flyers. On paper, she appeared virtually impenetrable to aerial assaults, making close approaches or hits exceedingly difficult. Nevertheless, amid this splendor, Shinano entered a world gripped by turmoil. The laborers assembling her no longer included the expert artisans who had forged Yamato and Musashi. Numerous seasoned shipwrights had been conscripted for combat duties. Their substitutes consisted of draftees, young scholars, and even enemy captives. Standards of craftsmanship, formerly a hallmark of Japanese naval yards, declined sharply. Seams meant for radiographic examination received only superficial glances. Precision requirements, once gauged to millimeters, widened to centimeters. The urgency to finish her showed no mercy. Directives from Tokyo insisted on readiness by November 1944. Construction pressed on non-stop. Workers succumbed to fatigue and were hauled off, swiftly succeeded by fresh hands. Summer temperatures within the enclosed basin turned suffocating. Winters brought numbing chill to fingers. Incidents multiplied. Individuals plummeted from heights, got pinned under shifting metal sheets, or succumbed to welding vapors. Fatalities received minimal acknowledgement. The national cause overshadowed personal losses. Resources faced shortcuts as well. Premium alloy meant for her shielding occasionally shifted to pressing alternatives. Lesser alternatives filled the gaps. Pre-war imported cabling, now scarce, gave way to makeshift fixes when stocks depleted. Features intended for backups turned into vulnerable linchpins. The colossal vessel relied as much on sheer resolve as on technical prowess to stay intact. Even so, progress mounted steadily. With each passing month, her framework ascended. She transcended mere vessel status. She embodied a seafaring metropolis, a testament to mankind's drive. On the dawn of October 8, 1944, the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal buzzed with eager resolve. Following it symbolized the enduring spirit of Japan, evidence that amid aerial raids and sieges, the realm could still produce marvels. The proceedings commenced with solemn rituals. As day broke, Shinto clerics in pristine garments conducted cleansing rites. They brandished flowing streamers of paper, intoned timeless invocations, and scattered salt to sanctify the site. And shrine arose by the prow, adorned with tributes of grain, seafood, and rice wine. The clerics invoked the kami, deities of waves, gales, and metal, to safeguard the craft and bestow triumph. Senior fleet commanders appeared in formal attire, adorned with decorations. Envoys from the royal court attended. The protective canopy concealing Shinano for years had been dismantled in sections, permitting beams of light to bathe her form. The flotation sequence followed exact protocols. Basin 6 would fill gradually via regulated gates. As the level climbed, Shinano would gradually rise. From its foundational supports, the vessel would be released to drift upward. Tugboats would then escort it to an outfitting berth, where the last pieces of gear would be fitted aboard. This was a routine the yard had executed countless times before. How could anything go awry? Promptly at 10:30 a.m., the command came to start the inundation. Employees spun the valve handles, allowing seawater to pour into the basin. Initially, the process unfolded smoothly. The level climbed gradually, inch upon inch, edging along the Shinano's exterior. Onlookers observed with anticipation. Suddenly, disaster unfolded. The barrier gate isolating dry dock number 6 from Tokyo Bay gave way. The enormous metal shield, built to resist the sea's immense force, buckled beneath the strain. Rather than a measured influx, a raging deluge of seawater exploded inside with irresistible power. The noise resembled a thunderstorm, an overwhelming rush that overwhelmed every other sound. Within moments, vast quantities of water flooded the enclosure. Instead of ascending calmly, the Shinano was struck by a surge of liquid. The enormous craft lurched ahead like a stopper ejected from a flask, its 70 tons of metal propelled by the hydraulic surge. It collided with the opposite end of the dock in a grating impact that rattled the ground. The jolt rippled across the facility, breaking panes half a mile distant. Anchoring lines as thick as a person's wrist broke apart like string. The backlash hurled them slashing through the sky with deadly velocity. One line severed a laborer's head. Another pinned 3 individuals against a gantry. The vast body of the hull bounced back from the collision and veered laterally, its rear end battering the dock's flank. It oscillated wildly, like a gigantic wrecking device, demolishing whatever lay in its way. For several agonizing minutes, disorder dominated completely. Employees scattered in terror, some leaping into the turbulent waves to evade the oscillating structure. Others were carried off by the flood. Commanders bellowed directives lost in the din. The meticulously planned event had devolved into calamity. The musicians' tools lay strewn about, banners ripped loose, the Shinto shrine reduced to fragments. Once the water settled and the Shinano halted, the extent of the harm was assessed. Astonishingly, amid the fury, the vessel itself suffered no core structural harm. Its shell showed indentations and abrasions, warped components and fractured barriers, yet its wholeness endured. The toll on lives told a different tale. 17 employees perished, 43 were hurt. Certain remains were lost forever, carried into the ocean, or mangled past identification. Yet the deepest wound might have been to the spirit. For the Japanese laborers and mariners, vessels weren't just mechanisms. They harbored essences, vital forces demanding due reverence. A craft whose debut was stained by mishap was deemed afflicted by ill fate. Such a turbulent, unchecked debut represented the direst harbinger. News raced through Yokosuka and farther afield. Murmurs trailed any reference to the Shinano. She had claimed lives prior to even meeting the waves. The waters themselves appeared to spurn her. The fates had averted their gaze. Captain Toshio Abe, freshly tasked with leading the Shinano, sought to quash such notions. A resolute, no-nonsense leader who had endured Midway, he tolerated no such folklore. Addressing the team, he waved off the incident as inconsequential. Metal and machinery lack souls, he asserted. Resolve and preparation secure victories, not portents. Yet even in his words, he noted unease among his subordinates. Seafarers tend toward the mystical, and Japanese ones particularly. Numerous offered discreet tributes at sacred sites, imploring safeguards from the malediction they felt adhered to their charge. The fixes following the launch fiasco were hurried, mirroring the haste enveloping the entire project. Fresh panels were fused over marred sections. Deformed parts were pounded back into shape or swapped out. Coatings concealed the blemishes. In just 3 weeks, visible traces of the upheaval vanished, though those present could not erase the recollection. Visions of that colossal frame thrashing to and fro, the cries of the mangled staff, the conviction that an essential flaw had emerged. Such impressions lingered, efforts picked up with renewed frenzy. The November wiring setups warranting full examinations received only superficial glances. It appeared that outward completion equated to readiness. The personnel detailed to her mirrored this rush. Typically, an aircraft carrier's force would rehearse jointly for months prior to sailing. They would practice relentlessly, ensuring each member mastered not only their role, but could substitute for comrades. Fire suppression, the skill of preserving a damaged craft, demanded specialized proficiency. Squad seasoned, the command staff attempted exercises, but the timeline was rushed, the personnel too inexperienced. During simulations of flood response, disorder prevailed. Sailors wandered astray in the labyrinth of corridors. Gear ended up misplaced. Commands got garbled. Whispers of the hex lingered among the ranks. Lower officers noted requests for reassignments, excuses of sickness, or even self-inflicted wounds to dodge service aboard Shinano. The onboard cleric, a Buddhist monk, performed ritual after ritual to ease anxieties. Still, every rite appeared to highlight the issue instead of resolving it. What reason could there be for repeated purifications if all was well? As November dawned, pressure mounted. The cutoff was no longer looming. It was here. Prepared or otherwise, Shinano must set out. The peril from U.S. subs intensified daily. Reports indicated scores of foe subs patrolling Japanese seas. B-29 raiders ventured deeper from their Mariana outposts. It was just a question of when they'd spot and obliterate Shinano right at her berth. The closing days of outfitting turned frantic. Items meant for precise placement were simply dumped on deck. Supply boxes piled up in any available spot. The unique armaments destined for her, 50 Oka kamikaze glider bombs and multiple Shinyo speedboats packed with explosives, were crammed into her bays. These armaments, emblems of Japan's dire straits, fit perfectly as freight for a vessel in such plight. On November 11, 1944, Shinano entered service with the Imperial Japanese Navy. The event was low-key, far from the pomp tried at her launching. No music echoed. Scant officials showed. Captain Abe recited the formal directives in a monotone. The Hinomaru banner ascended her pole. She now counted as a combat vessel officially, albeit far from battle-ready. The induction laid bare her unfinished state. From 12 furnaces, merely 8 worked. This cut her top velocity from the planned 27 knots to roughly 20 knots. Her detection gear operated at half capacity. A portion of her defensive cannons wanted proper shells. The lifts for raising aircraft from storage to deck had gone unproven with weight. Worst of all, numerous bulkhead seals, the partitions to isolate waterlogged sections, remained untested against strain. Captain Abe drafted a catalog of flaws spanning 17 sheets. He forwarded it to Fleet Command, urging a postponement until key fixes at minimum. The reply came quick and firm. Shinano would depart on time. The fleet leader's logic blended tactics with politics. Rumors of the giant carrier circulated. She had to emerge as a beacon of power, not end up as a blasted ruin exposed. The departure directives were precise. Shinano would leave Yokosuka under cover of November 28th night, head southward hugging the shore, and arrive at Kure Naval Base in the Seto Inland Sea. There, shielded from subs by tight channels and from aircraft by remoteness, she'd finish her setup. The trip should span about 20 hours. How much trouble in a mere 20 hours? The team readied itself, blending honor and apprehension. They manned the globe's biggest combat ship, an engineering wonder. But they also crewed an incomplete craft with raw hands, most of whom deemed her doomed. Final messages went to families. Belongings were secured. A few sought out Shinto altars, making donations and pleas. Some downed sake to numb worries. The accompanying force was slight. Only 3 destroyers, Isokaze, Yukikaze, and Hamikaze. Each had seen heavy action before. Their teams skilled, though hulls battered. Detection and echolocation setups, hurt in prior fights, had received spotty fixes. They'd depend more on visual watches than tech. For guarding the planet's premier carrier, it felt insufficient. Yet every spare destroyer served fronts elsewhere. November 28, 1944, nightfall brought false serenity. At Yokosuka Naval Yard, Shinano's enormous silhouette geared for exit. Pressure rose in her heaters, guide lamps glowed. At the helm, Captain Abe scanned the maps once more. The path was simple. Southward by the shoreline past the Bozo Peninsula, then toward Kure. They'd navigate darkness to evade U.S. flyers and cling to land to cut sub-risks. At 6:00 p.m., Shinano's anchors released. Tugs prodded her enormous frame. Far from the dock, her propellers started churning gradually, building momentum steadily. For the initial time, the enormous vessel propelled itself forward independently. In spite of the hasty build, the ill-fated christening, and the unfinished mechanisms, she remained awe-inspiring. Her frame extended almost 900 ft in length. The carrier deck towered 60 ft over the waves. In unison, the quartet of vessels steered toward the port's outlet and the vast ocean ahead. While navigating the anti-submarine barriers safeguarding the inlet, a few sailors spotted what seemed like yet another ill sign. A lifeless albatross drifting on the surface, its pale wings extended as if in defeat. Unbeknownst to anyone on board, some 30 mi southward, the USS Archerfish was commencing her mission. The sub had served as a rescue vessel, stationed to retrieve U.S. pilots from an airstrike scrapped by foul conditions. Released from that role, Commander Enright had surfaced his craft to replenish power cells and ventilate the interior. Conditions that evening suited sub-patrols ideally. Shadowy to conceal their sleek profile, serene for optimal acoustics, with a faint lunar glow to detect foes. At 8:48 p.m., the radar technician announced, "Contact, direction 020, distance 12 millimeters." The echo on the display loomed substantial, consistent, and progressing southwestward around 20 knots. Enright hurried to the conning tower, lifting his field glasses. Faintly discernible against the skyline, he discerned a shadowy bulk flanked by tinier silhouettes of guardians. His heart raced. Clearly not a freighter. The scale, velocity, accompanying vessels all pointed to a significant combatant. In the command center, navigators set up their maps and computation tools. The chase had begun. Enright confronted a pressing challenge right away. The objective cruised at 20 knots. Archerfish's top speed on the surface reached just 19 knots. Conceptually, the sub stood no chance of overtaking. Yet, Enright recognized that Japanese craft frequently weaved to evade subs, and such deviations would reduce their progress. By forecasting the rhythm and shaving turns, he could narrow the gap. Over the following 60 minutes, Archerfish dashed at full throttle, her quartet of diesels laboring intensely. The vessel shuddered from the exertion, her casing slicing into the undulations, foam cascading across her foredeck. Down below, mechanics urged maximum output from the power plants. Heat in the machinery space climbed beyond 120 degrees F. Crew rotated duties, scrambling upward for breaths of clean atmosphere before descending again. Aboard Shinano's command post, the radar crew picked up the U.S. sub nearly at once. The gear may have been only semi-reliable, but it sufficed to detect a surface trace from miles away. Captain Abe absorbed the update with a somber nod of approval. He had anticipated such encounters. Japan's surrounding seas teemed with them, though he possessed strategies to counter this danger. Alert the screening ships, he directed. Foe sub at 170 degrees, 8,000 net or off. Abe's strategic position proved intricate. Though immense, his charge proved defenseless. Lacking planes for sub-detection, her hydrophones remained inoperable. She relied solely on her companions for defense, and he understood their strengths were constrained. The escort's echo sounders had suffered war damage, fixed with subpar parts. Their explosive throwers held mere fractions of loads. Resources dwindled across the board. Furthermore, Abe grappled with a tough choice. Directing the destroyers after the sub meant detaching them from Shinano, risking exposure to hidden threats. U.S. Packs commonly used decoys to lure away protectors while flankers struck. Yet holding the escorts near allowed the follower to trail undetected, signaling their spot to reinforcements or planes. Abe opted for the cautious path. He'd maintain his screens tight and employ velocity plus dodging tactics to elude the stalker. Initiate evasion sequence 7, he instructed. The rudder veered, and Shinano's colossal form embarked on a sequence of directional shifts. 45 leftward, hold for 10 minutes, 60-degree rightward, maintain for 8 minutes, return to main heading for 15 minutes, cycle anew. This serpentine maneuver formed a routine defense against subs, yet it carried penalties. Every alteration bled velocity and progress. A journey slated for 20 hours now stretched further. Fuel usage spiked, and above all, the routine lent itself to dissection and foresight by a seasoned sub-skipper, which was precisely Enright's approach. Inside Archerfish's nerve center, the plotting crew meticulously followed every alteration in Shinano's path. Lieutenant Commander Robert Bobczynski, serving as the executive officer, leaned in close to the chart table, calculating bearings and durations. She's adhering to a typical zigzag routine, he noted. By anticipating her turns and intercepting them, we can close the gap. What unfolded was a perilous contest of navigation. Shinano veered off, widening the separation. Archerfish, in response, shaved the angles, narrowing it once more. Though the sub couldn't rival the carrier's direct line velocity, opting for more direct paths allowed her to stay even. This demanded exact computations and steely resolve. A single error might mean breaking off the pursuit. Spotting from the escorts could unleash a storm of depth charges. As the pursuit stretched into the darkness, the carrier's unfinished state started to show its weaknesses. Around 11 p.m., the starboard inboard propeller shaft's bearing started to overheat. The enormous shaft, spinning rapidly, produced heat the bearing struggled to shed. Indicators spiked into the danger zone. The engineering chief confronted a grim dilemma: press on and court disaster, or ease up and invite the sub's strike. He opted to throttle back that shaft's power. Shinano's pace fell from 20 knots to 18. The drop appeared modest, yet it proved decisive. Suddenly, Archerfish wasn't merely matching her but pulling ahead. Aboard the sub, the sonar technician detected the shift in the quarry's propulsion noise. "Target's decelerating," he called out. Enright allowed a brief grim grin. The dynamics of the pursuit now tilted his way. Yet Shinano's difficulties were only mounting. The frantic maneuvering, paired with her partial build, strained mechanisms across the vessel. Makeshift wiring gave way. Illumination wavered in certain areas. Air circulation ceased. The already warm lower levels turned unbearable. Crew in the engine spaces needed shifts every 20 minutes to avoid collapse from the heat. Worse still, the frequent direction shifts made the hull twist and sway beyond its unfinished design's limits. Poorly joined plates started to loosen. Not sufficient for sudden inundation, but enough for trickles. Fluid gathered in lower holds. Bilge systems kicked in to handle it, though multiple units malfunctioned. Untested in real conditions, their flaws surfaced now. Up on the bridge, Captain Abe fielded update after update on glitches. Individually trivial, together they revealed a vessel fraying at the edges from the strain. He grappled with a torturous call. Further deceleration to coax the ship safely to harbor, rendering her more vulnerable, or push the pace and chance major collapses. He settled on a compromise, dropping to 16 knots and toning down the evasive maneuvers. By 2 a.m. on November 29th, the intense pursuit had dragged on for more than 5 hours. Archerfish had narrowed the range to 7,000 yards, still beyond torpedo range, but near enough for reliable tracking. The sub's team was drained, yet buzzing with anticipation. Victory felt within reach against their elusive foe. Enright pored over the position logs with laser focus. Shinano's routine was clarifying. Amid the dodges, she kept reverting to a primary heading of 210 degrees southwest bound for Cure. If Archerfish could maneuver in front of that line, if he could foresee her settling onto it, the opportunity would arise. "Descend to periscope depth," he commanded. The vessel submerged, exposing just her radar mast to the waves. This cut her velocity but rendered her nearly undetectable. She transformed into a shadow predator under the night sky, unseen yet vigilant. Aboard Shinano, anxiety thickened. The sub had shadowed them relentlessly for hours. What held it back from striking? Why hadn't the escorts repelled it? A few officers theorized it was summoning reinforcements, luring them into an ambush. Captain Abe brushed off the fears aloud, though doubts gnawed at him inwardly. U.S. sub-strategies had sharpened over the conflict, bolder, more synchronized. At 2:56 a.m., destiny struck. ISO on Archerfish, the sonar watch's tone sharpened with urgency. Fast propellers inbound, destroyer at bearing 340, approaching rapidly. Enright had mere moments to act. Brace for depth charge assault! The destroyer thundered straight overhead. Ahead, her propellers churned powerfully beneath the surface. Every crewman aboard Archerfish held his breath, bracing for the rumble of depth charges, yet none exploded. Isokazi had broken contact and, worse, disobeyed Captain Abe's command to stay in formation. A crisp command from Shinano's control room directed her to resume her station. As soon as Isokazi veered off, Enright raised Archerfish to periscope depth once more. Shinano remained visible, holding her heading, now just 4,000 yards distant. The chance Enright had anticipated throughout the night was finally within reach. By 3:15 a.m., conditions were ideal. Shinano settled on her steady course of 210. She presented a broadside aspect to Archerfish. Range, 1,400 yards, speed, 16 knots. In the realm of undersea combat, this was an optimal scenario. Near enough for precision, oriented to expose the widest profile, and moving slowly enough for an accurate firing solution. Enright conducted his last sweeps through the scope. The carrier dominated his field of vision, enormous and unprecedented in scale. Her flight deck loomed like a sheer wall. The superstructure atop her deck towered like a skyscraper. He spotted illuminated portholes, the silhouettes of accompanying vessels, and the foaming wake from her prow. He jotted a hasty sketch, noting her unusual bulbous bow, which differed from any in the identification guides. "Final bearing and aim set," he commanded. "Prepare all launchers." In the forward torpedo bay, 6 Mark 14 fish were primed. These armaments had plagued early operations with faulty fuses and erratic depths, but upgrades had resolved those issues. They now served as dependable hullbreakers, each packed with 600 pounds of Torpex, depth set to 10 feet, Enright directed. It was a shallow mark, but he recalled counsel from a veteran commander: strike carriers low to induce capsizing rather than mere inundation. The plotting team finalized their computations. Vessel velocity, approach angle, and separation were inputted into the analog torpedo data computer, which determined the proper gyro angle. They verified the solution twice. No opportunity for a retry existed. Launch 1. Archerfish trembled as the initial torpedo departed its tube. A burst of high-pressure air propelled it forward, its screws whirring to life and propelling it at 46 knots toward the objective. Launch 2. Intervals of 8 seconds allowed each to vacate the path before the subsequent release. Launch 3, Launch 4, Launch 5, Launch 6. Within under a minute, 6 lethal projectiles surged through the depths toward Shinano. The torpedoes performed flawlessly. Hot, true, and on track, just as engineered. Their faint trails in the gloom cut direct paths to the carrier's flank. From Shinano's command post, sentries detected the wakes at the last instant. "Torpedoes to starboard!" The alert rang out. Captain Abe called for hard right rudder, but the behemoth's inertia delayed her response. She had scarcely initiated the maneuver when the lead torpedo connected. The detonation was colossal. A geyser erupted beside the side, surging above the hangar level. The vessel heaved to port under the force. Before the personnel could respond, the next struck, followed by the third and fourth. 4 impacts in under 30 seconds, all along the starboard beam, spanning from stem to the bridge tower. The initial one slammed into frame 104, adjacent to an aviation fuel hold that luckily stood empty. The blast ripped a 20-foot gash in the plating, swamping nearby sections at once. The second pierced frame 142, demolishing the outer starboard engine compartment. Operators inside perished immediately amid the rush of seawater and scalding vapor. The third breached frame 166, exposing fire room number 3 to the ocean. The fourth tore into frame 190, breaching a further fuel bunker and spilling oil into corridors. For an instant, the bridge watch struggled to grasp the assault. Shinano quaked with every blow, yet her immense size made the strikes appear minor. Captain Abe's initial assessment was that she could weather the harm. She had been armored like a capital ship, built to endure repeated such attacks. But in the lower levels, disaster accelerated. The rushed build that had dogged her construction proved deadly now. Untested bulkheads gave way without resistance. Certain hatches sealed prematurely, dooming sailors in submerged zones. Others wouldn't latch, permitting unchecked inflow. Rushed welds fractured under strain. Soaked wiring boards sparked and failed in cascades of electricity. Response squads mobilized as effectively as possible, yet they battled an impossible tide. The crew had never trained cohesively. Directives clashed and overlapped. One group hurried to ballast opposite holds on the port flank to offset the tilt. Another attempted to dewater the breached areas. The clashing actions only compounded the chaos. Down in the propulsion spaces, conditions grew dire. The starboard engine compartments submerged swiftly. Crew members linked arms in desperate lines to fasten down shifting objects, yet their efforts proved pointless. A tanker truck slipped its moorings and slammed against the island superstructure. Crates filled with shells spilled overboard into the waves. From the bridge, Captain Abe held his poise with iron discipline. He commanded the introduction of counterflooding to balance the lean. He steered toward the closest coastline, aiming to ground the vessel. He sent urgent dispatches to Fleet Command. Shinano torpedoed at 32 ladder north, 137 miles east, striving to make landfall. Yet, even while issuing these directives, he likely grasped the harsh reality. Updates from the lower levels painted a bleak picture without exception. The inundation had spiraled beyond management. The pumping systems lagged far behind. Roughly half the personnel were unfamiliar with their assigned repair areas. The vessel was succumbing. Aboard Archerfish, Enright had plunged the sub into depth right after the launch. Now arrived the riskiest phase for any undersea craft, the enemy reprisal. Overhead, Japanese escorts darted to and fro, their detection gear beeping steadily, teams arming explosive payloads. Down to 400 feet, Enright directed. Prepare for quiet mode. The boat sank into the murkier depths. Silence gripped every soul on board, breaths held tight. The racket from the escorts echoed down, the sharp whine of propellers at speed, the sharp pulses of search sonar, the heavy plops of ordnance hitting the sea. The initial salvo went off, 5 blasts ripping in rapid succession. The hull shuddered violently. Bulbs burst overhead. Tiles of corkliner cascaded from the ceiling. Still, the detonation stayed remote, at least 500 yards off. The foe's faulty, neglected sonar failed to pinpoint the sub's location accurately. Additional barrages came next, totaling 14. Each blast rippled shock through the ocean, jarring the vessel, though nothing struck near enough for real harm. After roughly an hour, the noises from above faded into the distance. The escorts had abandoned the pursuit and swung back to aid their stricken ward. When Enright at last surfaced Archerfish to periscope level with the rising sun, the sea lay deserted on the skyline. The fate of the enormous flat top remained a mystery, but she had vanished. As daylight pierced the sky on November 29th, Shinano writhed in her final agonies. The angle had climbed to 20 degrees. Navigating the canted walkways grew untenable. Personnel resorted to lines for hauling themselves along the inclined planes. Down in the hangar bay, the mustard-hued kamikaze aircraft had come adrift, colliding wildly, their unstable propellant posing a dire blaze threat. The deluge had extended well past the torpedo strikes. This mirrored what ship designers termed cascading inundation. Seawater snaking via hatches, ducts, wiring conduits, any gap, proliferating like a malignancy across the structure. Sections meant to stay dry were submerging. The sheer mass of the flood, numbering in the thousands of tons, pulled Shinano lower into the depths. Captain Abe launched a final bid to rescue his command. He called for maximum power across all drives, urging the carrier landward. Yet with just the portside units operational, she managed scarcely 10 knots. She veered in loops, her steering gear powerless against the lopsided propulsion. By 08:30, Abe greenlit the crisis alert. Get set to evacuate. Not a full abandonment yet, but a heads up to stand by. Hands mustered atop the flight deck, aiding injured mates from the bowels. Flotation gear passed out among them. The accompanying destroyers edged nearer, ready to retrieve those in peril. In the submerged areas below, acts of valor and sorrow unfolded. Machinists stuck to their duties, sustaining power and suction until the rising tide expelled them. Corpsmen toiled in listing infirmaries, hauling the ill to safety. In a single swamped room, 30 sailors found themselves sealed behind a stuck portal. Their frantic knocks echoed for an hour before falling mute. The conclusion struck with abrupt fury. At 10:18, the heel surged to 35 degrees. Gear, fighters, and crew tumbled wildly off the flight deck into the foam. The command rang out, everyone off the ship. But for countless others, time had run out. The swift worsening pinned hundreds within. Those scrambling up the sloped expanse slipped and plummeted. A few leapt from the carrier's top, enduring a 60-foot plunge that proved fatal for most. Captain Abe stayed put on the bridge. True to custom, he chose to sink with his charge. He lashed himself to the wheel, resolved to uphold honor until the last. Nearby, his top aides followed suit. They raised voices in the anthem as the seas climbed about them. At 10:55, Shinano overturned. Her deck swung beyond the perpendicular. She flipped fully then. Briefly, her enormous frame showed above, encrusted growth and crimson anti-fouling coat shining under the dawn light. Next, amid a colossal rush of venting air, she dove under the waves, the Lar. The world's biggest warship at the time lasted barely 17 hours on the ocean before going down. The waters where Shinano met her end were strewn with wreckage and frantic sailors. More than 2,000 souls had started the journey. Hundreds now battled the oil-smeared waves. The trio of destroyers navigated through the chaos, hauling in those who made it. Yet the effort was discriminatory. Maritime custom demanded prioritizing officers for rescue. Certain destroyer commanders, toughened by endless conflict, turned away anyone displaying fear. Rescue the resolute alone. One skipper instructed his team, leading to disaster after disaster. Sailors who escaped the wreck perished right before the eyes of nearby vessels. Some, coated in fuel, proved too slick to grasp and vanished under the surface. The frigid winter ocean accelerated the toll. Exposure felled those not retrieved swiftly. By the time operations wrapped, 1,080 had been pulled from the depths. The other 1,435, encompassing Captain Abe and the bulk of his top brass, met their end. It ranked among the deadliest single-vessel disasters in the Pacific theater. For Japan, the blow was devastating, yet it demanded concealment. Shinano had embodied a national enigma. Her demise stayed shrouded. Those who lived took oaths of silence. Kin of the lost heard merely that their relatives fell in battle, without details on location or manner. Archives were locked away. To ordinary Japanese citizens, Shinano had never been real. But wartime confidences prove elusive. U.S. code experts, poring over captured signals, uncovered the incident almost immediately. Shinano's moniker surfaced in deciphered dispatches, complete with her coordinates at the torpedo strike. Spies scratched their heads. No vessel matching that description appeared in their files. What exactly had Archer Fish taken down? When Enright submitted his mission log in December, asserting the destruction of an enormous carrier, doubt greeted him. Naval Shinano tipped the scales at 71,890 tons when fully laden. She truly held the crown as the era's biggest carrier and endures as the mightiest warship ever felled by a sub. Enright's gut feeling proved spot on, his turnaround absolute. Shinano's lone outing offers insights that echo far beyond the happenings of November 1944. It's a narrative of arrogance and restraint, of lofty goals thwarted by core weaknesses, of how the tiniest hunter can topple the grandest quarry under the right circumstances. To Japan, she symbolized the collapse of the decisive blow doctrine. Across the conflict, imperial planners chased ultimate armaments, colossal battleships, kamikaze assaults, wonder carriers. Yet, victories stem from networks, not icons. As Japan forged a solitary giant, America churned out fleets of modest carriers. While Japan shoved half-finished hulls into harm's way, America invested in skilled personnel. The outcome was foreordained. Engineering takeaways rang just as true. Bulk sans sturdiness invites peril. Plating without effective firefighting breeds illusionary safety. A vessel's power resides not solely in metal, but in her sailor's preparation, the craftsmanship of her build, the soundness of each joint and barrier. Shinano stumbled not from faulty blueprints, but from rushed assembly. For the undersea fleet, the event affirmed their grinding campaign. Subs, inexpensive and manned by under 100, could obliterate flagships costing exponentially more. The stealthy branch demonstrated hits on any foe, anywhere. any time. Subs had ascended as pivotal tools of strategy. Commander Enright's arc from setback to triumph echoed across the fleet. It illustrated how a single lapse doesn't doom a path, how tenacity and bravery can eclipse prior errors. He'd confronted his shadows and triumphed. The Navy Cross awarded him honored not merely the Shinano kill, but his resolve to press on post-losses. The toll on lives lingers as a grim shadow. More than 2,400 Japanese mariners perished, many draftees dragged into a fight they never sought. They succumbed in inundated holds, hurled from listing surfaces, or left adrift in icy swells. Their deaths yielded zilch. Shinano fired no aircraft in combat, shielded no territory, validated no expenditure. These days, she slumbers at 4,000 meters off Cape Omazaki, inverted on the seabed, her deck entombed in muck, her frame yielding to abyssal crush and erosion. She serves as a crypt for her fallen crew and a reminder of an epoch when countries chased supremacy through sheer magnitude, convinced a flawless arm could rewrite history. Contemporary fleet tacticians examine Shinano as a warning. Amid nuclear flat-tops and missile subs, her teachings endure. Complexity competence is essential. Scale requires backing. No vessel, regardless of its might, surpasses the framework that constructs, sustains, and deploys it. The incident also highlights fortune's influence in combat. If Shinano had departed a day sooner or later, if Archerfish had been dispatched to another sector, if the torpedoes had plunged deeper rather than skimming the surface, the course of events would have shifted. Conflict involves not merely tactics and innovations, but also serendipity and precise moments. During that November evening in 1944, every element converged ideally for Archerfish and disastrously for Shinano. Post-war, the tale of Shinano and Archerfish evolved into a mythic account among seafaring experts. Writers penned volumes, scholars dissected the confrontation, former sailors recounted their experiences. With each retelling, nuances emerged, inaccuracies were rectified, and the account we recognize formed. Commander Enright advanced to a distinguished career in the Navy, stepping down as a rear admiral. He seldom discussed the incident openly, embodying the reserved expertise of submarine operations. Queried about that evening, he responded plainly, "We fulfilled our role. The torpedoes performed. Fortune favored us." Yet those close to him grasped its profound significance, the affirmation of his bravery, the validation of his leadership, the opportunity he had grasped anew. The Archerfish team convened gatherings for years. These events brought together veterans who had aged from youthful crewmen, evoking their pinnacle achievement. They narrated the extended pursuit, the strain of closing in, the roar as the strikes landed true. Yet certain Shinano survivors, once the shroud of classification dissolved, shared their accounts. They described the turmoil, the dread, the view of their colossal craft capsizing and vanishing beneath. They recalled Captain Aby's last stand, rigid amid rising waters. They evoked shipmates who aided their flight from inundated areas, who surrendered flotation gear, who urged companions to safety before succumbing to the depths. In Japan, Shinano embodied the conflict's closing chapter, lavish endeavors yielding naught, splendid collapses amplifying the agony. She signified the peril of embracing fabricated narratives, of mistaking facade for truth, of charging into ruin over conceding loss. For the United States, the loss underscored the egalitarian essence of maritime battles, how 80 souls in a submersible could vanquish multitudes aboard an aircraft carrier, how perseverance and expertise could topple bulk and plating. It echoed the foot of her destined splendor eternally entombed on the ocean bed, a testament to overreach beyond capacity. In our era, as countries vie to craft the grandest, most formidable combatants, Shinano's legacy endures. Progress marches on, yet the personal elements that sealed her fate linger. Vessels continue hasty assembly. Personnel embark underprepared. Commanders cling to the notion that a singular ultimate armament alters all. Shinano's specter cautions against such arrogance. Perhaps the broadest insight is this. In warfare, as in existence, speed does not guarantee triumph, nor might the fray. At times, endurance outlasts force. At times, the pursuer turns prey. At times, one evening's deed resounds across ages, imparting to future eras lessons in valor, error, and the narrow divide separating success from catastrophe. On that November night in 1944, two craft crossed paths in the Pacific's gloom. One stood as the biggest of its type ever constructed, the other an ordinary undersea boat without unique renown. At dawn, just one endured. Such is the essence of oceanic warfare, abrupt, conclusive, irrevocable. The sea discriminates not by dimensions or robustness. It engulfs everything impartially, guarding its mysteries in abyssal shadows where Shinano slumbers, the mightiest warship ever toppled by a submarine. A colossus brought low by a stalker it scarcely detected,